It seems like things are a big mess in Turkey. Tell us how bad it is and how people are reacting.
It's pretty bad as far as the slump in the Turkish lira. But what's more important is the dollar is now at a one-year high against all currencies. This includes the euro, the pound, the rand. So it's not just a Turkish problem at this point. However, despite the currency crisis, there is no real crisis. There is no lines at ATMs to withdraw money, or unlike other countries we've seen, there is no panic. Panic hasn't set in yet. So I don't think it has yet to become a real crisis. And I think as time goes on, we'll see if it can be stabilized or not.
The lira, of course, lost a third of its value in the last week. Is it wise for President Erdogan to continue this fight with the US on this level, given the consequences?
The problem is the currency crisis now that we see, the economic problems in Turkey now, are a direct result of the November elections in the United States. So Donald Trump and Vice President Pence are trying to find a reason, trying to find a cause that will galvanize the electorate to go out and vote for them in November. 42 Republican seats are up for grabs in the House of Representatives. If they lose more than 21, then they lose the House of Representatives in total. So the ruling party of the Republicans will be out of power. This leaves President Trump without the control of the House of Representatives, and it will be very difficult for him in the future. So what he's doing now is he's coming up with a reason to fight Turkey, to fight anyone for that matter. A country far off away sounds great. There's a pastor in Turkey now that's been arrested for ties to terrorism. He's been in prison for almost 2 years, but only now, when it's close to election season, has this become an issue. So this is no longer an economic problem. It's a financial problem. It has less to do with Ankara with Turkey than it does with Washington, frankly.
Now, as you mentioned, it has, of course, dramatically affected emerging markets, including the South African rand. What's the government's plan to turn things around?
So most of the sales that have been happening that you see in the Turkish lira, and frankly for the rand, aren't locals selling their liras and buying dollars. They're foreigners contacting local banks in Turkey and shorting the Turkish lira and the rand, for that matter. So what they do is they borrow local currencies in those countries, and then they sell those currencies and buy dollars locally, and expect that those currencies, the local currencies, will go to zero, or we will continue to further devalue, and they will buy them back at a cheaper price and make a profit. This is called shorting, as you know. So this has now been capped to some extent by the Central Bank of Turkey. So they're saying you can still do this, but there's a limit to that. It's not unlimited. And today, the Turkish lira fell much less than it did the last 2-3 trading days. So I'm not sure what the Central Bank of South Africa is doing, but absent these type of steps, all emerging markets, including South Africa, will suffer. And so this needs to be reined in as soon as possible.
I'm glad you mentioned the central bank, because some international economists are saying that the central bank isn't doing much. It's simply talking about announcing a new plan to deal with this, but there's not a real tightening of financial conditions. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Not really, because this morning liquidity was pumped into the markets in Turkey. The reserve ratios were decreased across the board. This allowed for easier borrowing of Turkish liras. And like I said, the restrictions on shorting or borrowing liras to sell are essentially an interest rate hike. The Central Bank of Turkey has already hiked interest rates more than 500 basis points in the last few months. And the people who sit on the central bank are graduates, have PhDs from London School of Economics, from Imperial College, the world's best colleges. So to hear people say, there's not enough independence, or these people don't know what they're doing. They're CEOs of banks, previously Lehman Brothers, huge banks globally. So we're talking about the creme de la creme of the financial institutions in the world, of academics. And I think people are just looking for an excuse to blame the central bank. I mean, they're doing what they think is best. And central banking in general is an art. It's not a science. If it were a science, then Alan Greenspan wouldn't have destroyed the U.S. economy. Ben Bernanke wouldn't have destroyed the global economy in 2008, et cetera. So these are not people. These are people who are running these banks with their own perspectives and with their own ideas. So, like I said, they're doing their best to come out, on top in a difficult environment. And I hope the same goes for South African central bank. And that's really the situation. I mean, it's a global environment, and we'll see what happens. All emerging markets are suffering now and will continue to suffer. The political circumstances of the United States' strong dollar policy. If it continues this way, the entire world will be shook by this. And the saving grace for Turkey and for South Africa will be, if these economies collapse, it will be 10 times worse than the Greek economic collapse of 5 years ago, because these economies are much larger than Greece. Turkey is 5 times as big as Greece. South Africa is similarly in the same situation. It will be a cascading domino effect that will be felt around the world, and everyone will be really in tough shape if this is allowed to continue. So I think the European Central Bank will step in here and prevent continuation of this, or else Europe will be in much worse shape than it is now.